So last class, we started talking about associative learning. And what was associative learning? What do we mean by associative learning? Well, associative learning is just the act of learning that two things go together that you didn't know went together. So the classic case is Pavlov's dogs, where if you shine a light and give, you like shine a flashing light and then you give some dogs some food, over time, they will learn that flashing light and food get associated together. So if you just give them the light, they'll anticipate the food and start drooling. So what we talked about last time was that there's two different views about what is actually responsible for this sort of mechanism. On one side, there's the view that it's actually logical thinking and propositional thinking, and it's basically done in a language of thought. The other view is that this sort of so when you learn a association, what the dog is learning is something to the effect of, if I see a light, then food will be presented. The other side, the dual process theory, says it's a mechanical process. It's just a matter of, if you give something a light followed by food enough times, a link forms in the mind such that anytime food is presented, it will or anytime a light is presented, will automatically trigger someone to expect food to be presented. So why are we talking about associative learning? Well, if we go back a couple classes, you'll remember that I was discussing the idea that maybe the language of thought, the idea that all thinking is propositional, is mistaken because we make all these mistakes in our reasoning. We oftentimes draw the wrong conclusions. We make mathematical mistakes. And if we think in a fully propositional logical way, if that's like wired into our minds, that shouldn't happen. So there was this idea that while Fodor was right, and those like him are right, some thinking is in this logical propositional manner, there's this other system, a purely mechanical, associative, things get linked together system, and that's responsible for when we're not thinking hard, when we're not putting in the effort. So on the table right now are these two different views. Everything is language of thought, propositional, and half of it is, and then half of it is this associative dual process. So that's in the background. And now what the associative learning discussion is meant to do is it's like a particular battlefield between these two views. If a dual process theory is right, then associative learning should be a classic case in which we have signs that the system is operating in this mechanical way, that things just get linked together. If, however, we could find that associative learning shows signs of being propositional, that would be a strong indicator that our mind does not have two different processes and actually everything is propositional. So that's the background. This is kind of a battleground between these two different views of how the mind works. Is there one system in there, or are there two different systems? And remember, we also said last time, the reason that this is important is which system is responsible for these sorts of associative learning mechanisms has practical implications. If you think that it's propositional, then classic associations such as racism, of people of a certain race being bad, the way you would explain to these people that they're wrong is using language, using words. If, by contrast, racism is a product of these just brute force associations, then the only way you can get an implicitly racist person to stop being implicitly racist is decouple those associations. You show them people of color doing good things over and over again, or you show them, so it would be a mechanical way of responding to it. So that's why this stuff is interesting. This is what's in the background. So what I want to talk about today is the evidence in the Mitchell, DeHauer, and Lovabond article that is designed to show that the propositional view is the correct one. And so what I want to do is just talk about and this is going to serve two purposes. One is that it's just going to allow us to investigate this question of which one's right. And at the end of class, we're not going to have a clear-cut answer, but I think that it will, we'll see arguments on both sides. Second, if you're somebody who's interested in psychology or interested in philosophy of mind or anything like this, then this article is kind of a very classic way in which people argue about the mind. It's kind of like an exemplar for what arguments in psychology look like. the way in which people try to draw big conclusions from particular experiments and then argue about whether the experiments are interpreted correctly, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just a useful way of trying to understand, like, what does psychology look like in practice and how do people think about psychology? Well, this is an article that shows that. All right, that got a little rambly. I'm a little hyped up on caffeine. So did that make sense to everyone?
Yes.
Okay, just making sure. All right. Whew. I need to take a few deep breaths. So like the fourth cup of coffee just hit. So it's like suddenly I'm, finally really pumping full of energy. All right. So what I want to do now is, and we talked about this last time, basically, if the dual process theory is correct, it makes certain predictions about associative learning. If the propositional theory is correct, it makes different predictions. And so the way you then decide is you then look at the real world in experimental settings and you see which predictions prove to be more correct. And so just to review, the dual process theory, if it's a purely mechanical process by which associative learning happens, then what we should find is that learning associations should take no effort. And as we said a couple classes ago, effort is a limited resource. Mental effort, you can't do very long division and memorize all the precedents at the same time. We don't have the mental resources. So if associative learning requires a person to be putting in a lot of mental effort, then doing other complex mental tasks should prevent you from learning associatively. If, however, the dual process is right and it requires no effort, then you shouldn't be affected. You should still learn associations, even if your mind is elsewhere and you're doing other things. So that's the first difference. The second one is the dual process says this should be automatic and unconscious. So what this means is you should respond to associations, even if you aren't consciously aware that there's an association there. So if I were to ask you something like, oh, do you believe that if I show you a light, you'll get food? And you say, no, I don't believe that. That's not something I believe. And yet if I were to show you the light, you would still start salivating. That would be a sign that this is unconscious. If by contrast, you only ever show the associations, you only show indications that you've learned it, if it's available to conscious reasoning, then that's a sign that it's a propositional approach. The last two are kind of related. The first one is if dual process is right and it's purely associative, then it shouldn't be sensitive to verbal arguments. Why? Well, because verbal arguments involve propositions. You believe that, or you say that the sky is blue. I believe that the sky is blue. So if your understanding of light and food being associated together is just purely mechanical, then that's not going to be open to any sort of argument. If it's the case that somebody just in their mind, it's wired in there that say blackness is bad, then you're not going to be able to untangle that by explaining to them reasons why not. Why? It's purely just wired in there. In the same way, you can't explain to, if you have like an electrical charge running from a battery to a light, and just like you press one button, the electricity, you can't explain to the battery, don't turn on the light. It's just going to do it automatically. If, however, it is sensitive to verbal instruction, that's a sign of propositional. Last one is logic. If it's a purely mechanical process, then giving logical explanations for something shouldn't work. If it's the propositional one, it's of course going to work, because just the way in which propositional reasoning works is in terms of the rules of logic. So against that background, now we can start talking about the actual experiments. And just to give it away, if you didn't have a chance to read the article argues that the propositional one is right. And it tries to show that each of these four conditions is met when we actually look at actual instances of associative learning. So I'm going to erase the board, but is everyone on board with this on board with what's going on in the background? All right. So let's talk about the requires effort or is effortful. And so the first thing the article argues is that there's these experiments in which people don't actually learn the associations if their mind is overloaded. So just to give an actual example of the of an experiment. There was this thing by Dawson and his colleagues, I think it said in the 70s. Here's how the experiment works. Basically, I give you 6 different beeps in your like headphones, like beep, 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 different tones. And in the control case, what happens is of these 6 tones, so tone 1, you always get an electric shock. Tone 2, you never get an electric shock. Tones 3, 4, 5, 6, you sometimes get an electric shock. So if you're not being asked to think about many other things, what do you think happens when you start over time, you hear these tones and then you do or don't get electrical shocked? What ends up happening? What do you learn?
You develop a fear of the beeps.
Yeah, you develop a fear of the beeps, but more importantly, which beeps do you start to fear more? Do you ever fear, like over time you hear, and they're very different in tone. Like you know that like tone 2 would be like, brr, and you never get a shock. While tone 1 is like, mee, and you always get a shock. Well, these ones are in the middle, and sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. So yeah, what ends up happening is, first off, you get very afraid of tone 1. So every time you hear that very high-pitched beep, you get afraid. And interestingly, this is just a fact about human beings. When we get afraid, our skin conducts more electricity. I don't know how exactly they measure it, presumably with those little pads that they put on you. So what they find is if somebody's been trained in this way, if you then give them tone 1, they conduct a lot more electricity. If you give them tone 2, nothing really happens. 3, 4, and 5 are somewhere in the middle. People get a little more activated, but not as much as getting a lot. So that's the control. However, what they discovered is if you ask people to do a complicated task while they're doing this, they won't learn these associations. So what they did was they asked people, memorize what the tones, I'm gonna give you 5 tones, memorize what sequence it is and recite back to me what this pattern of tones was. So imagine I gave you like 3, 5, 6, 2, 1. And then I asked you like, tell it back to me. So that's taking a lot of mental effort. And what they found was in this sort of circumstance, the subjects never learned that tone 1 was going to be more likely to cause a shock. And so basically what ended up happening is if you looked at the skin conductance in these cases, subjects who were asked to do this complex task, there was no difference in the skin conductance between 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6.
I've only been using it like for decaf shots, really.
I just checked it and it's completely.
So does everyone understand the nature of?
I'll use my candy for decaf shots if we need, but.
Eddie, I think your mic's on. All right, thank you. No worries, happens. But does everyone understand? Will, is that a hand, William?
Yeah. So you say that like we can control our skin conductance just with our mind?
So here's the cool thing. It's not the sort of thing that we consciously do. It's not like when I think in my head, I'm like, control my skin conductance. It's rather that if you want to control your skin conductance, make yourself afraid, and you will. Like that is one of the physiological responses. And you can kind of, like if you actually think about, is anyone like me kind of afraid of needles? And you know that feeling, you kind of get that feeling when you see the doctor coming in to take your blood.
Yeah, that's like
Feeling. That is, yeah, the anxiety feeling. One of the ways that manifests physically is in skin conductance. So yes, your mind literally does control how much electricity is in your skin. Now again, you're not gonna, like when you feel it, you don't feel it like electricity. Instead, you feel it like anxiety or anticipation or fear. But yes, your mind literally controls that physical process, which is really cool. So that's the background. And against that, the conclusion to be drawn was, hey, look, if you actually look closely, the dual process theorists say it shouldn't make a difference whether you're doing this other complex task or not. It's just something that happens in the background. Your mind should just automatically, it's this other system. It's running in the background. It just associates things together. The propositional people are saying, no. If you actually look at this sort of evidence, the evidence is that we need effort to learn these things. And if we don't put in that effort, then we're never going to learn these associations. So that's how the argument for it being effortful. Now, in the background, when we get to the end of this, it's not going to be the end of the story, but the way the argument goes is that, okay, we've looked at the data. There are experiments in which people don't learn associations unless there's conscious mental resources available. Therefore, point in the favor of the propositional approach. Do people understand how that argument is meant to go and why this is designed to show it? Could it be argued that by an advocate of dual process, this is simply a special rule to the theory, such as Fodor argued with ceteris paribus? Great question, Eddie. Let me come back to that a little later on. The short answer, though, is yes and no, like so many different things. What a person can say is, I guess the reason why a propositionalist would say that, like, hey, that sort of response isn't ideal in this case is because mental effort is something that the dual process theory really builds into the theory itself. So with the ceteris paribus clauses, it's usually when you trigger one of those, you trigger it by bringing in something from outside the domain you're interested in. So for instance, in Fodor's geology example, the reason a river erodes its banks, except when it doesn't, is when something outside the realm of geology gets involved. So if human beings come along and build a dam. But in this case, the reason that a propositionalist would say, hey, dual process people, this isn't a good candidate for ceteris paribus clause, because attention is the very thing we're interested in talking about. We're talking about how this sort of thing works. Now, this isn't to say that a dual process theorist would have nothing to say in response. They could say something like a certain minimal level of attention is required. And if you overpower it by doing a really complicated task, even these basic mechanical processes can't work. So I think there are things they can say, but I think a propositionalist would have something to say in response to the ceteris paribus clause approach. Now, to be clear, though, I think that you could now respond to me in a very effective way and try to argue that, like, hey, no, this case you're talking about is a ceteris paribus available clause. But so first off, great question. Second off, hopefully that was responsive. All right. Interestingly, this experiment also seemed to show the second of these criteria, which was the consciousness versus unconsciousness. And just as a matter of fact, the article doesn't go into a ton of detail on this. And so I'm not going to go into a ton of detail. But basically, there's a strong correlation between somebody's skin reaction to shocks and their consciously being able to say, like, oh yeah, I recognize the pattern. So if a dual process theory is right, then it shouldn't make a difference. Like, your skin conductance with the shocks should be something that is just mechanically drilled into your brain, or into your mind, such that over time, you will pick up on the pattern, even if you don't say you're consciously aware of it. But interestingly, people in this sort of skin conductance experiments, or the shocking ones, they will show no conductance, no conductance, no conductance. All of a sudden, they're going to start showing conductance. And if you ask them what's going on, they'll be like, oh, I just realized there's an association between tone number 1 and a shock. So that's suggesting that, again, the propositional approach might be right. It seems like when you suddenly become aware of this association, or when the association has been learned, you are consciously aware of it. And this is a classic case in which, like, to go back to what I said before about this article kind of shows how psychology is done. The article cites about 7 articles, doesn't go into supreme detail on them. So if you wanted to assess this argument, you'd have to go through article by article by article and see exactly how it worked. And each one of those is going to be something that the dual process theorist could respond to. They might say something along the lines of, once the associations have been learned, then you can get conscious awareness of it. So what this is picking up on is that the person first learns the association, and then once they've learned the mechanical association, they introspect and discover, oh wait, and then it's available to consciousness. So there's always something to say on the other side. But this is how Mitchell, DeHauer, and Lovabond argue. They say, look, the fact that people only start to show the skin conductance response at the exact same time they become consciously aware is a sign that these sorts of learnings are available to propositional knowledge, or are available to consciousness and are then a sign of propositional learning. All right. The last two are verbal instruction and logical rules. We're at 11:08. So let's start with verbal instruction. So as I said, if the dual process is right and these associations are purely mechanical, they're not going to be available to verbal communication, because associations, like an associative linking system, is not the sort of thing that deals in words and propositions. And so Lovabond did this really cool, they talk about a few experiments in this article, but this one was, I think, one of the coolest ones. So the way it worked is you first give people two tones or two stimuli. The way they talk about it is, where's my blue marker? A and T. And so what they discovered is if you give people A and T together and then you give an electric shock, people very quickly learn what? Well, what if I give you A and T and then give you an electric shock, and I give you A and T again and give you an electric shock? Now imagine I give it to you a third time. What's your body going to do?
Get anxious.
Yeah, it's going to get anxious. It's going to get ready. So that's the background. Now in step 2 of the experiment, they give someone just the A. So we can imagine this is a light and this is a tone. So you give someone a light and a tone together, and then you shock them. Light and tone equals, I'm going to erase this. However, what they then did is give somebody just the A tone, so, or just the light, not the tone. And what they discovered, and then the key is you don't give them a shock. So you give them just A alone, and then you don't give them the shock. So then guess what happens if you give someone just T? So here's the experiment. You first give them A and T together, shock them a few times. You then start giving them A alone and don't give them a shock. Now, what do you think happens if you give person just a presentation of the tone?
Nothing.
So interesting, it's not nothing. So think through it this way. You've just gotten A and T together a bunch and you get shocked. You've now seen A and you don't get a shock. So you now are just getting T. Yeah, you get ready for the shock. Why? What is, like, if we're talking, imagine you could think. What would the reason be? Well, you explained to yourself, well, T must have been the thing to cause the shock. So what ends up happening is, the way an associationist would explain this fact, like the way the propositionalist explains it is that in your like unconscious reasoning, what happens is I recognize that A and T together cause a shock, but I know that A couldn't have caused the shock. Therefore, T must have caused the shock. If you're a propositional, or if you're a dual process theorist, you explain it in this way. A and T together are linked with a shock. So I now have this association between A and T together. However, now presenting someone with A without a shock decouples a link between A and the shock. But what's left is the link between T and the shock. So you can see in this case, both groups can explain what happens. But this is where the propositionalist response comes in. And what they discovered is that if you give this part here, the A no shock, if instead of actually presenting people with A and giving them no shock, you just simply say to them, now imagine this. Imagine that, or they don't say imagine, they say, now, as a matter of fact, were I to give you A, there would be no shock. And they do this verbally. Like, this isn't you present someone with A and then don't shock them. You just say out loud, now think of that very same light you just saw. And if I were to present that to you, you would get no shock. Interestingly, if you then present the person with T, they show the same body response. So their body gets ready for the shock, even if they were not presented with A. So this is suggesting that whatever it was that was leading you to expect a shock after this this tone is sounded, it affects you regardless of whether A is presented to you as an actual tone without a shock or is just described to you, which is suggesting that the learning is open to linguistic argument. Do you understand? Does everyone understand that sort of? It's a really, really clever experiment design, because what you're trying to do as the propositionalist is show like, hey, we are our associative learning is open to our verbal argument. So let's test and show that the same associations that happen without language can happen with language. And that suggests it's the exact same mechanism in place. So that's how the propositionalist, the sort of arguments or the sort of experiments that are used to say that, no, actually, this is, these sorts of associative learning mechanisms are available to language and therefore probably are propositional. Are we on board with the first three, how they argue it? All right, let's go to number 4. 4 is, so I'm just gonna put no lang, check. All right, the last one is that it's, oh, William.
So for the Dawson test, like the beep test, how would a dual process theorist like reason that?
So the way, first off, the data is not something they'd expect. So the prediction of the dual process was this shouldn't happen. But then once they found it did happen, the way they might respond, and I'm not sure, I'm not super familiar with this literature, so I'm not certain how they would, but one response that the article suggests they might give is that in truth, no mental process is purely like automatic. It always requires some effort. So the main difference, it's not a matter of kind. So what a dual process theorist would say about that sort of beep test, the Dawson beep test, is a propositionalist is saying it requires, say, this much energy, while say it's like 99%, while a dual process theorist is going to say it's maybe 1%. And so what they're going to say is when you overload the system, and what happened is you overload the system with 100%, then it doesn't matter what on earth is going on down at the ground level. If you only have 100% capacity and all 100% is taken up by this beep memorization test, then it doesn't matter whether the automatic system uses only 1% or if you have a non-automatic system that's using 99%. So the way they one way they argue for it is to say, no. If you load up the system so much that there's no difference here, like if you have 100% used, it doesn't matter whether the task you're trying to perform requires 1% more or 99% more. It's not going to work. So that's one way they respond to it or could respond to it. Again, I'm not certain how it actually gets responded to in detail in the literature, but that's how they do it. They'd say, even if you say it's automatic, we don't literally mean it requires no effort. Brain power requires some effort at all times. Therefore, you've just given such a complicated task. Even the most complicated task and the simplest task, neither of them are going to work in this case. All right. So the last one with the logic is basically what this experiment was designed to show is that, let's see, where's the logical rules? Shanks and Darby, let's just put up their names. And here's how the experiment went. So first off, you gave people 2 stimuli, A, B, and when A came, it was accompanied by a second stimuli. Let's just call this a shock. So if you give someone A, they get a shock. If you give someone B, they get a shock. If you give them A and B together, they don't get a shock. You then give them C and they don't get a shock. D, they don't get a shock. You give them D, C and D together, they do get a shock. So what ends up happening is people come to anticipate, if you give them just A, they get scared. You give them just B, they get scared. You give them together, they don't get scared. You give them C, they don't get scared. D, they don't get scared. C and D together, they do get scared. Now, this was the experimental thing. Now, you could say that now this alone, either group can explain. The propositionalist is going to say that what happens is the person runs a rule in their head. They've learned that combining the two together causes an opposite response. So if you give someone A and B, they then realize A and B together gets canceled out. If you give C and D, even though individually they're negative, together they're positive. A dual process theorist will instead say you have learned 6 different associations. 1, you've learned the association of A, you've learned to associate that with a shock. B, you've learned to associate that with a shock. The combination A and B together, you've learned not to associate with a shock. And the same down here. And then here's the experimental condition. You give someone I, which is a positive, J, which is a positive, and you give them IJ, I think it was M and N they chose, M minus N minus. Oh no, this should be a plus. So what are the predictions of the two groups? If according to dual process theorists, the reason you associate A and B with this has nothing to do with these two up here. It's rather you've just associated negative with the combination AB. So according to a dual process theorist, what do they predict should happen if you present someone with I and J together? What should happen? Well, what should happen is this person who's never been presented with I and J together shouldn't have any sort of learning at all. They've never been presented with the stimulus IJ. And in the same way, if you give them M and N together, they should form no judgment whatsoever about what happens when you put M and N together. However, as a matter of fact, does anyone have a guess as to what actually came up when you presented someone with I and J together or M and N together? Any guesses for how this actually came out? After you'd presented someone with I and a shock and J and a shock, and you'd already taught them this stuff, what ended up happening? Yeah, they weren't scared. I and J people did not end up being scared. So they anticipated, even though they'd never had I and J together, they reasoned, oh, this one must be like that one, so I shouldn't be scared. Well, with the M and N, they did. So this was a sign that it looks like the way that people are learning these things is much more complicated and much more rule-based than is often assumed by the dual process theory. Again, this is a complicated and weird experiment. So one thing a dual process theorist could say in this case is like, this is a very strange, odd experiment that needs to be digested a little bit more. But that's designed to show like, hey, if we were actually learning these associations in a purely mechanistic way, then how on earth are we drawing conclusions in these senses? So hopefully, did that last one make sense to people? Well enough. And again, if this didn't make sense and you're interested in writing about this sort of stuff for a paper, feel free to rewatch the video, email me, or just read the article about 12 more times, which is what I resorted to. So the last thing I want to talk about is, well, there's 2 more things I want to do. 1, I want to talk about animals. And then 2, I want to say a little bit more about how the dual process theorist responds to these sorts of things. Because as I said, these arguments are designed to show the propositional view must be right, but that's not the end of the line. So zooming out for a minute, why is it that people were motivated to treat associative learning as a sort of mechanistic things being associated together sort of argument in the first place? Why was it that people didn't want to say like, no, propositional views, there's reasoning, like when you learn that a light means a piece of food or that food's coming, you developed a little thought like, oh, I know that the light signals food. Why is it that people started to think it has to be a mechanical process in the first place? Any guesses or any hypotheses? It's more of a historical fact than anything else. Where were the first of these experiments done? Or who did them and what were they done on? The famous one, yeah, dogs, right? These were experiments were initially done on dogs. Yeah. So the first associative learning studies were done on dogs. And here's the thing about dogs. They aren't humans. We might talk to them like they're humans, but we all know they aren't humans. They aren't as smart as humans and everything else. And very often, especially earlier in time, we like to think of ourselves as a much smarter, better, far beyond any other species. So part of the motivation for thinking that this sort of associative learning had to be mechanical was there was this big tendency to not want to attribute to dogs and other animals the sort of complex propositional thoughts that we think we engage in. So the idea was, if dogs are capable of learning this and dogs are dumb, therefore it has to be mechanical. So just to put down the steps of the argument went something like this. 1, dogs are dumb. 2, dumb things can only learn mechanically. 3, dogs learn associatively or learn associations. So the conclusion was associations must be learned mechanically. That says mechanically in case you can't tell. So this was how the argument was supposed to go. These days, and this is one of the things that the article talks about, is people have started to call this argument into question. And anyone have any idea which of the premises is the one that people have been focusing on?
Is it behaviorism?
Yeah, so this is actually, so in the background, tied in with this, one of the things, one of the reasons that there was a close association between behaviorism and the assumption that animals are dumb. There was this idea that we're assuming animals are dumb, therefore we need to explain their learning. So we have to go with a behaviorist explanation. That's part of the reason why behaviorism got off the ground so effectively, is behaviorist explanations were very useful on rats. And there was this assumption that rats are really, really dumb. So Ray says 1 or 2. And this is really, this is the key one. I'm gonna focus on 1. Because it seems like if you're willing to say that animals are actually quite smart and a lot more mentally complicated than we often give them credit for, the whole argument falls apart. And a lot of the motivation for this associative learning mechanism falls away. So I just want to talk a little bit about why we should think animals are a lot smarter than our ancestors usually thought they were, and are actually like cognitively complicated enough that as soon as you recognize that animals are, like, to explain animal behavior, you have to say there's this sort of propositional learning and propositional processing going on. To be clear, it's not going to be in a matter of something that we could think of as a language. Like, it's not like your dog is thinking in English. It's rather just having mental processes that follow logical rules in some format. But so what are the sorts of evidences that animals are actually a lot smarter than we give them credit for? And that what's going on in their head is actually pretty complicated. And going back to Mohammed's point, a lot of these things are cases, like some of the evidence that people point to these days were initially developed to respond to behaviorist arguments. So I can never remember who did this experiment, but it's very interesting. According to a behaviorist, or somebody who thinks that animals are just mechanical little processes, they don't learn rules, they don't build mental pictures, they're just dumb creatures. How do they explain how a rat gets through a maze?
Wait, is it kind of like Skidmore, like idea of behaviorism when he uses like the lab trap, or I think, of using the.
I can never remember the names on these ones.
I think it's Skidmore or something like that. I'm not actually sure.
Describe the experiment just to see if I'm talking about the same thing you are.
I think it's kind of like the lab rat or the mousetrap or something like that, where he did an experiment like on the rat, where depending on like what do you call it? Like reward and punishment. That thing.
Yeah, so I'm not, so yes, this is related to that Skinner lab rat sort of stuff. So in terms of the way it went, according to Skinner, how is it that a rat learns to get through a maze? So let's imagine we've got a maze here. I'm just going to draw a really crappy fast maze. Cheese. So if you put a rat here, what's going to happen? We want to set up a maze, see how it would work. There was no incentive. So yeah, so first off, yeah, Eddie, there's a couple different things to say here. One of the experiments, according to a behaviorist or someone who says this is dumb, all that's happening is the little mouse is just building a sort of, it's like learning behaviorally how to get to the cheese. So what gets programmed is the mouse is just literally getting programmed. You put it here, and I know now my bodily behaviors have to go in this way, and my bodily behaviors have to go this way. And the idea was supposed to be that the only reason the animal is learning this mechanism is that the creature has some reward for learning to install these instructions in its body. But what they discovered, there were a few different things. First off, if you didn't actually let the rat walk, you instead strapped it into like a tiny little rat wheelbarrow and just pushed it around, the rat was still going to learn how the maze worked. And the reason why is it seems like somehow the rat developed a mental image in its mind of how this sort of thing worked. So Ray says, you put rats in a maze and let them walk around. They don't learn how to escape, but when you give them a prize at the end, the rats know immediately. So another thing that this shows is if you just put a rat in a maze by itself, it's not going to in any way try to escape. It's just going to walk around. But then if you give it incentive to try to get out or to go a certain place, the rat will immediately take a direct path to the reward. And so what this is suggesting is that the rat didn't need the reward to learn in the first place. It learned simply by being placed into the maze. So what this is showing is the mouse or the rat is building a representation in its mind of what the maze looked like just by walking around, exploring. And then once you gave it a reason to employ that maze, it immediately went for it. So this is designed to show, like, think about in your mind right now, imagine you want to get a sandwich. Like, think about what would you have to do to get a sandwich? And it seems like what you have to do is you think mentally of like, where am I? Where in my mental map is the closest place to get a sandwich? And then what steps would I have to take to get there? And this is a rather complicated process. And the fact is, it looks like rats do the exact same thing. It looks like rats are actually capable of building mental maps, and then when they're given reason to employ them, they will then go and do it. Another one to talk about, one of my favorites, octopuses or octopods, not octopi, but don't get me started. Anyway, I can't draw one, so I'm just going to draw something with 8 legs, which is going to look a lot like a spider. 2, 4, 6, or maybe arms or whatever they have. How many of you have eaten octopus? Anyone ever eaten octopus? I don't especially like it, but I have eaten it. So we don't exactly think of them as the smartest animals, but in truth, octopuses are really, really clever. So one thing that octopuses can do is learn by observation. So what is it to learn by observation?
You are like observing your surrounding, being self-aware.
Yeah, so you observe what's going on. So instead of, you can think of the classic case, it's like a monkey see, monkey do sort of case. You learn to do something not by doing it yourself, but by watching someone else do it. So why is this something that's worth talking about? Children do it all the time, but it's actually a really complicated mental process. Why do I say it's a complicated mental process? Well, think about what it requires to learn from observation. So first off, you need to observe what's happening in the scene. So yeah, so there's also this thing, the mirror gene, which very interestingly is tied in with this. Or no, it's the mirror neurons. There are these neurons that fire in response to seeing somebody else do an activity, which is actually, we could go into mirror neurons for a long time, but I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. But just think about how complicated it is to learn by observation. So if here's my head, I first have to see what you're doing and then represent in my head, say I'm watching you unscrew a cap on a bottle. I have to represent you as unscrewing the cap of this bottle. I then have to change this representation and recognize that this individual here can be replaced by a different individual, namely myself. So I now have to form a representation not of this individual doing it, but rather of me doing it. And then I need to, so I have to recognize that this situation has a person who can be replaced by a different agent doing the same thing. I then have to recognize that I am myself an agent capable of doing this thing. I need to recognize how that person's action went and respond and model my action accordingly, and then do the exact same thing. And so why is this interesting? And why am I saying that would essentially be the same thing as a child watching their parent doing the favor? And that, yes, Eddie, that's exactly what I mean by behavioral or observational learning, is like, yeah, a child doing a thing, they watch their parent do it, they reprocess it, and then realize, hey, I can do that thing, which we typically think of only as the sort of thing that like complex organisms do. Also a sign that we should like think children a lot smarter than we generally treat them as being. But interestingly, octopuses pass this jar test. If you give an octopus a screw-on lid jar with some food inside so that it's motivated to get to it, it will just kind of pull on it, won't know what to do. If you then take the jar from the octopus, unscrew the jar, show the octopus the food, screw the top back on and hand it to the octopus, it will immediately unscrew the jar and grab the food. So this octopus is able to recognize like, oh, this human being did this thing. A human being is an agent. I, the octopus, am also an agent, and I can represent myself doing the same thing the human did such that I can carry out that behavior. So other sorts of things, if you want to like go down a very fun rabbit hole, just look up the waggle dance, which is how bees communicate. The waggle dance is this literally the way bees figure out where honey is. They fly off to some honey, they fly back, and then they shake their butts in a certain direction and to a certain rhythm, which tells all the other bees how far away the honey is. To be able to carry out this waggle dance, they have to have an incredibly accurate mental representation of where they're going. So what this is all designed to show, William?
I know that hummingbirds can like remember every single flower that they go to, and then they can also remember like if you have like, you know, one of those things like a feeder for them, they remember you like as the person who refills it.
Yeah, and I mean, so that's a great case of like, that is a lot of mental processing. Like a hummingbird is able to identify different individuals and remember them. And I mean, even things like, if you think about a dog, dogs are capable of some pretty complicated processing. Interesting thing, dogs have evolved to follow human eyesight. Oh, another really classic case of showing how complicated dogs are is everyone knows the puppy face, right? The face the puppy gives you when they want something. Well, they've recently discovered like there were two hypotheses as to why puppies make the puppy face. And so the original hypothesis was they just straight up associated, if I do puppy face, I get food. So there was this basic association. And so what this suggests is if this is how the puppy is responding, then the puppy should make puppy face anytime it wants food, just because it is mechanically associated. Puppy face, get food, puppy face, get food. Shouldn't matter where they're doing it. But they've recently discovered that puppies only make puppy face when they can tell that a human being is looking at them. So if you're looking the other direction and the puppy wants food, it won't make puppy face. But if it knows you're looking, it will then make the pathetic puppy face of give me some food, which like the level of mental processing here is pretty complicated. The puppy has to represent, one, that it wants food, two, it has to represent you as looking at it, and three, represent that you are the sort of thing that is going to be able to be manipulated by puppy face and won't then be responding to it if you're looking the other direction. So like dogs are themselves quite complicated, which is also just a hilarious thing about dogs, that they know how to manipulate us. Like they make puppy face only because they know on some level that you will respond to it and that your attention is focused. So anyone who says puppies are dumb, no, they're manipulating you. You don't have a pet dog, your dog has a pet human. So that's the third, like a background reason for why maybe we should go more propositional. One of the main reasons to think that we were dual process in the first place is that like, oh, we need to explain animal learning. But the more and more we learn about animals, the more and more it looks like animals are quite intelligent, and that the only thing, like there's only certain things we can do that separate us from other animals. And if you think that animals are smart, then it seems like much of the reason to say that we need associative learning kind of goes out the window. All right, that's the bit on animals. All right, so right now I just spent a long time talking about all the cases that the propositional theorist brings up to say the propositional view is the good one. And now I just want to highlight that even though we've talked about this, there are many things that the dual process theorist can say in response, and there are still some issues that the propositional theorist like cannot account for. And I can't remember who brought this up last class, but there is still the fact that we make if you're a propositionalist, you still have to confront the fact that human beings are incredibly irrational and make lots and lots of logical mistakes. So if you go fully propositional, you're still left having to explain all those experiments that motivated us to discuss the dual process in the first place. All the things about how people overestimate the likelihoods of certain things, underestimate others. You still have to explain things like, all right, if I tell a person like, over and over again, spiders aren't dangerous. Like that little spider you see isn't dangerous. It's not dangerous. And yet I put this person in front of a very small spider, they might still get scared. Like there are ways in which human beings are very irrational, and a propositional theorist still has to account for these things. And if we take it at face value that it's just like logical processing, we still don't have answers to those questions. So the first thing that a dual process theorist can say in response is, one, there are still irrationalities. And so in the article, Mitchell et al. Say the response a propositionalist can give is like, hey, we're saying that it operates in terms of logic. We're not saying that logic is always perfect or that humans are always perfectly rational. But there is still, just to highlight, that's not a totally satisfactory answer, because you're still left wondering, all right, you say you're not fully rational, but I want an explanation. When are we not rational? How on earth do we account for this irrationality? And there still is this problem with the propositionalist of they cannot explain this fact. Also, the article talks about some actual experiments that suggest, well, yes, there are these experiments that suggest this stuff has to be conscious. There are some others which seem to suggest that maybe we can learn associations unconsciously. So just one experiment, this was the Perruchet eye shooty thing. Basically, how many of you, what happens if somebody comes up to you and blows on your eyeballs? Has anyone ever had somebody do it? They just come up to your face and go, what happens? I'll give you a clue. You blink. It doesn't feel good to have water. Yeah, you flinch or you blink. So the way this experiment worked is you just put like a little puff of air on the eyeball. So anytime that happens, if you expect it to come, you're going to flinch and close your eyes. Like if I know you're about to blow in my face, I'm going to close my eyes. So the way this worked is you put a little puff of air in front of someone's eye, and you associate that with a tone. So, so here's the eyeball, here's the wind, and then at the same time, there's a tone. And so anytime there's a tone, there's a puff of air. sometimes when there's a tone, so the way it would work is the association would be between tone and puff of air. And what they discovered is that if you give people a string of tones with, so the way it works, half the time the tone is associated by air, half the time it isn't. So what they've discovered is that if you give people this sort of situation in which half the time they see the tone, they get the puff, the other half the time they don't, then if you give them a circumstance in which they get 3 tones and puff together, so tone, puff, tone, puff, tone, puff, and then you give them a tone and you ask them, what do you think is going to happen at this point? And interestingly, what a person says is going to happen and what their body does are actually different. If you've gotten 3 in a row, you'll actually generally describe that you expect no tone. Why? Well, because of this thing, the gambler's fallacy, where if a pattern goes in a random pattern, we very often assume that things have to even out in the grand scheme of things. So if you ask someone, is there going to be a puff of air this time? They're going to say, no, no puff of air. But if you actually look at their behaviors, they're going to blink more strongly than they would normally. Why? Because on some level, their body seems to be assuming, oh, it's just happened 3 times in a row, so it's going to happen again. And so this is an experiment where the propositionalist has a hard time explaining this fact. According to a propositionalist, this learning is learned propositionally. Therefore, what you say out loud should be the exact same thing, which is determining your behavior. But in this experiment, what's determining your behavior and what you say out loud come apart. So we've gone over these experiments that the propositionalists like Mitchell, DeHauer, and Lovabond say, oh, this is proof that the propositional theorist is the right one. Now the dual process theory comes back. Why does it occur in this circumstance where in the previous study, which were very similar, there was no such reaction? This is an interesting question, Eddie. And this is the sort of thing where one of the things that the article writers bring up is that this is a really weird outcome of why on earth is this happening if it's so much like the other ones. And this is an interesting fact of psychology, which is oftentimes weird stuff happens in labs. And in short answer, Eddie, why does this happen? No idea. And according to a propositionalist, they're going to have to say that, well, there's something about this particular experiment which caused it to behave differently. While a dual process theorist is going to say, well, the other experiments, well, this is a sign that there is this dual process. There is this mechanical system. But in the other cases, the reason we saw those experiments that you all were talking about and you pointed to as evidence of propositional reasoning, those experiments were bad. So Ray brings up another question, which is, and this is something I didn't want to talk about for time, but it discusses it in the article. It does also seem another reason that another thing that dual process theorists often bring up is that it seems that associative learning very often seems to involve different parts of the brain than more classical cases of propositional reasoning. So very often you say, wait, if it's happening, if this sort of reasoning is happening in this part of the brain and this sort of reasoning is happening in this part of the brain, isn't that a sign that we do really have multiple processes? So for time reasons, I'm not going to get into the details of this, but I think that's a really good point to bring up. And the response which Mitchell et al. Give in the article is not entirely satisfactory. Their response is something to the effect of, but yes, brains are really complicated, and maybe it's just that learning propositionally involves multiple brain parts and the dual process involves multiple brain parts, and maybe it's just a lot more complicated than we think. And there is something to that. Neuroscience is not very developed yet, and we still like, who the hell knows what's going on in brains? But I do think that Ray is correct that one of the other things that dual process theorists has been able to point to is that very often classical propositional reasoning and dual process or these associative reasoning seem to happen in different parts of the brain. So just to summarize, we've got on the table these 2 different theories of how the mind is organized, and it looks like both views are still on the table. Both do some things well, and there's experimental evidence on both sides. So this is still a very active, interesting debate happening. But it's worth talking about for the reasons that I brought up last class about how there are practical implications. Dual process theory and propositional theory have different views on how you change someone's racist behavior. Or if you want somebody to stop doing certain behaviors, do you explain it to them, or do you just put them in a lab and force them through presentation to have formed different connections? All right, that's all I wanted to talk about in terms of the actual material for today. But are there any more questions at the end? We covered a lot of stuff today. If you have any questions for me that don't pop up till later in class, or later in the semester, I'm, oh, there goes my alarm. So if anyone has any more questions about this that aren't popping up right now, but come up in the next couple days and you want to shoot me an email, feel free. I'm also happy to talk about any of this stuff because I just find this stuff fascinating. I think the human mind is the coolest thing in the world. And so anything about what is it actually doing, how does it actually work is fascinating to me, which is part of the reason why I love this class so much. All right. So that's the background for now. Now I'm going to stop the recording and we're going to talk business. So nobody wants to watch this stuff. If you're watching this on the YouTube and you have questions about the business stuff, just email me. All right.